Look closely at the old photographs of the Rat Pack. Look past the blinding smile of Dean Martin. Look past the manic energy of Sammy Davis Jr. and the swagger of Frank Sinatra. In almost every candid shot taken between 1952 and 1981, you will see a shape in the periphery. A short, disheveled man with a face that looked like it had been slept in. He usually has a cigarette dangling from his lip, his tie is crooked, and he is looking at Dean with the watchful eyes of a Doberman. This is Mack Gray. To the casual observer, he looked like a mistake. Why was the most handsome, elegant man in Hollywood hanging around with this guy who looked like a low-rent bookie from the Bronx? But Mack Gray was not an accessory. He was the operating system. He was the reason Dean Martin could exist. Dean Martin wanted to float through life. He wanted to play golf, sing songs, and be left alone. He detested conflict, details, logistics, and decisions. Mack Gray was the man who absorbed the friction of the world so Dean didn't have to feel it. Mack was his musical director, who couldn't read music, his road manager, his bodyguard, and his only true friend. He was the keeper of the silence. Mack Gray didn't start his life carrying golf clubs. He started it carrying guns. Born into the rough streets of New York, Mack, born Max Green, was a product of the underworld. In the 1930s, he wasn't a Hollywood figure, he was the Killer. It was a nickname, but it wasn't ironic. He worked for George Raft, the movie star who was actually more of a gangster than the gangsters he played on screen. Mack was George Raft's muscle. He was the guy who made sure nobody bothered Mr. Raft. He knew how to handle a knife. He knew how to talk to the mob. He knew where the bodies were buried because he had probably helped dig a few holes. He was a creature of the night, tough, loyal to a fault, and completely unimpressed by fame. When George Raft's career began to fade, Mack didn't look for a new job, he looked for a new protectee. He found Dean Martin in the early 1950s, just as the Martin and Lewis explosion was happening. Dean saw something in Mack that he desperately needed. Dean was surrounded by phonies, by yes men, by people who wanted to use him. Mack didn't want anything. Mack was a street guy. He spoke the language of Steubenville. He didn't care about art, he cared about loyalty. Dean hired him. "What's my job?" Mack asked. "Just be there," Dean said. "And keep the idiots away from me." One of the greatest inside jokes in Hollywood history was Mack Gray's official title, musical director for Dean Martin. Mack Gray knew as much about music theory as he knew about astrophysics. He couldn't read a note. He couldn't play an instrument. If you put a sheet of music in front of him, he would use it as a napkin. But Dean insisted on the title. Why? Because it gave Mack the authority to stand in the recording booth. It gave him the power to tell the actual orchestra conductors, legendary men like Nelson Riddle, what to do. It worked like this: Dean would be in the booth, singing. He would finish a take. He wouldn't look at the producer. He wouldn't look at the conductor. He would look at Mack. Mack, sitting in the corner reading a racing form, would look up. He would give a slight nod. Or he would make a face. If Mack nodded, the take was good. If Mack made a face, Dean would say, "Let's do it again." It wasn't about pitch or timing. Mack was Dean's vibe check. Mack knew when Dean was faking it. He knew when the soul wasn't there. He was the audience surrogate. If Mack, a guy with a tin ear but a big heart, felt the song, then the truck drivers and housewives in America would feel it too. There is a famous story of a session where the orchestra was playing too loud. The conductor argued that the score required a crescendo. Mack walked over, cigar in mouth, and poked the conductor in the chest. "Too much noise," he rasped. "I can't hear the kid." The conductor lowered the volume. The record went to number 1. Dean Martin's greatest fear was not failure, it was conversation. He hated small talk. He hated people asking him for favors. He hated the social obligations of stardom. Mack Gray was the human shield. When they went to a restaurant, Mack walked in first. He scouted the room. He picked the table that had the best sightlines and the most privacy. He tipped the head waiter, using Dean's money, of course, to ensure no fans approached. When they sat down, Mack ordered for Dean. He knew exactly how Dean liked his steak, medium rare, his pasta, fagioli, and his drink, J&B Scotch, light on the scotch, heavy on the ice. Dean didn't have to speak. He just sat down and the world arranged itself around him. If a fan approached the table, Mack would intercept them 10 feet away. He wasn't polite. He was the killer. He would growl, "Not now, pal. The kid is eating." And the fan would retreat, terrified. Mack carried the money. Dean famously never carried cash. If Dean wanted to buy a pack of cigarettes, Mack paid. If Dean wanted to buy a car, Mack wrote the check. Mack handled the messy, gritty details of existence so Dean could remain floating in the clouds. But it went deeper. Mack cut Dean's steak. Literally. If the meat was tough, Mack would cut it into bite-sized pieces so Dean wouldn't have to struggle. It sounds infantilizing, but to Dean, it was the ultimate luxury. It was love. It was someone saying, "I will take care of the hard parts so you can just be." They spent more time together than most married couples. They were on the road for months. They filmed movies together. They played thousands of rounds of golf. And yet, they barely spoke. Witnesses say that Dean and Mack could drive from Los Angeles to Palm Springs, a 2-hour drive, without saying a single word to each other. Silence was their language. Dean didn't need to be entertained. He needed presence. He needed to know that someone was watching his back, so he could relax. Mack understood Dean's moods better than anyone. He knew that when Dean hummed a certain way, he was happy. He knew that when Dean tapped his ring against the table, he was anxious and wanted to leave. Mack would instantly signal for the car. No words exchanged. Just a psychic connection forged in thousands of hours of shared solitude. Mack was also the keeper of Dean's secrets. He knew about the affairs. He knew about the mob connections. He knew about the deep, crushing depression that Dean hid behind the drunk act. And Mack took those secrets to his grave. He never wrote a tell-all book. He never gave an interview. He was a vault. While Dean was always impeccable, tuxedo pressed, hair perfect, smelling of expensive cologne, Mack was a disaster. He was famous for being messy. He dropped cigarette ash on his clothes. He spilled mustard on his ties. His apartment was a chaotic jumble of old newspapers, racing forms, and dirty laundry. Dean loved this. He found it hilarious. He called Mack the unmade bed. "Look at him," Dean would say to the audience during his show, pointing to Mack in the wings. "He looks like he got dressed in a burning building." It was an act of affection. By having Mack, who was so unpretentious, so ugly, so real, by his side, Dean grounded himself. Mack was his connection to the earth. If Dean started to get too Hollywood, one look at Mack, with egg yolk on his lapel, would remind him of where they came from. Mack was also the target of Dean's practical jokes. Dean would cut the toes out of Mack's socks. He would put Limburger cheese in the air conditioning vents of Mack's car. He would light Mack's newspaper on fire while he was reading it. Mack never got angry. He would just grumble, "You're a sick man, Dino," and keep reading. It was how they said, "I love you." For 30 years, Mack Gray was immutable. Governments changed, wars started and ended, the Rat Pack rose and fell, but Mack was always there. He was as permanent as the scar on Dean's finger or the glass in his hand. Dean assumed, with the naivety of a man who refuses to look at calendars, that Mack would always be there. But biology does not care about Hollywood legends. In the late 1970s, the shadow began to fade. Mack started to lose weight. The messy suits began to hang off his frame like scarecrow clothes. The cough, which had always been a smoker's rattle, turned into something deeper, wetter, more sinister. Cancer. Dean's reaction was classic Dean Martin: denial. Aggressive, absolute denial. He refused to talk about it. When Mack coughed, Dean would turn up the volume on the television. When Mack looked tired, Dean would order another round of drinks and say, "You look great, Pally. Best you've looked in years." It wasn't cruelty, it was a defense mechanism. Dean couldn't process the idea of a world without Mack, so he simply pretended that world didn't exist. He tried to fix it with the only tool he respected: money. He sent Mack to the best doctors. He paid for experimental treatments. He bought Mack expensive gifts, watches, cars, as if material objects could bribe the Grim Reaper. Buy yourself something nice, Mack. Feel better. But the cancer didn't care about Dean Martin's money. It ate away at the killer until there was nothing left but skin and bones and loyalty. The end came in 1981. Mack Gray died. When Dean got the news, he didn't scream. He didn't throw a tantrum like Frank Sinatra would have. He went completely still. It was as if someone had reached inside his chest and turned off the pilot light. He went to the funeral, of course. He sat in the back, wearing dark glasses, looking like a statue carved out of grief. People came up to him to offer condolences. "I'm so sorry, Dean. He was a good man, Dean." Dean nodded mechanically. He didn't speak. What was there to say? "My operating system is gone. My translator is gone. My brother is gone." After the funeral, Dean went home. He went into his den. He poured a drink. And he stared at the wall for hours. For the first time in 30 years, there was no one to cut the silence. There was no one to make a face at. There was no one to catch the ash before it hit the floor. The silence, which Dean had always cherished as a friend, suddenly turned into a predator. It was too quiet. The weeks following Mack's death were a revelation of helplessness. Dean Martin, the multimillionaire superstar, realized he didn't know how to live. Without Mack, the friction of the world came crashing in. Dean went to a restaurant. He sat down. No one ordered for him. The waiter stood there, waiting. Dean had to look at the menu. He had to speak. He had to cut his own steak. It sounds trivial, but for a man who hadn't done it in decades, it was a reminder of his loss with every bite. The meat tasted different. The wine tasted sour. He lost things. He couldn't find his golf shoes. He couldn't find his lighter. He forgot appointments. Mack had been his external hard drive, remembering names, dates, and obligations. Without him, Dean was drifting. He became irritable. He snapped at assistants. "Where's Mack?" he would almost say, before catching himself. The cool facade began to crack. He started drinking more, real drinking, not the stage act. The apple juice was replaced by actual J&B scotch. He needed to numb the sensation of being exposed. Historians of the Rat Pack often point to the death of Dean's son, Dino Jr., in 1987 as the moment Dean Martin truly died. And they are right. That was the fatal blow. But the death of Mack Gray in 1981 was the moment Dean lost his armor. If Mack had been alive in 1987, when the plane crashed on the mountain, things might have been different. Mack would have been there. Mack would have handled the press. Mack would have shielded Dean from the worst of the pain. Mack would have sat in the room and just been there, absorbing the shockwaves. But Mack was gone. So when the tragedy of 1987 hit, Dean took the full force of the impact on his unprotected soul. He had no buffer. He had no shadow. And that is why he broke so completely. In his final years, Dean Martin became a recluse. He stopped performing. He stopped going out. He sat in his house, watching old westerns, waiting for the end. But those who worked in his household say that sometimes, he would talk to the air. "What do you think, Mac?" he would mumble during a commercial break. "Yeah, you're right. That horse is too slow." He kept Mac alive in the only place he had left, his memory. Dean died on Christmas Day, 1995. It is said that in his final moments, as the room grew dim, he looked toward the corner of the room. Maybe he saw a light. Maybe he saw angels. Or maybe, just maybe, he saw a short, disheveled man in a messy suit, with a cigarette dangling from his lip and a racing form in his hand, nodding at him. "It's a good take, kid. Let's go home." Mack Gray does not have a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. There are no documentaries about him. Most fans don't know his name. But without Mack Gray, there is no Dean Martin. He was the unsung hero of the Golden Age. He was the man who dedicated his entire existence to making sure one star could shine without interference. He was the definition of loyalty in a town that sold loyalty for a paycheck. Dean Martin taught us how to be cool. But Mack Gray taught us how to be a friend. So the next time you see a clip of Dean Martin laughing on stage, look to the side. Look into the shadows of the wings. You won't see him, but he's there. The killer. The director. The shadow. Nodding his head, cutting the steak, and keeping the world at bay.